am sometimes known to get on a roll and miss that. So if somebody sees something that I haven't responded to, feel free. But we're also a small group, so I also don't mind at all if you um, chime in any way that feels comfortable to you. That won't throw me off any more than anything else might throw me off. So a little bit on my background of where I come from in this space of COVID research is I'm trained as a psychologist and had been focusing on health equity issues related to people with disabilities for a while before COVID. And then when COVID hit, started looking at how this was disproportionately impacting our disability community. And, some of my work has just been frantically tracking what's happening because that in itself has been um, a challenge to keep up with. And for the purposes of that, my purpose has been trying to make sure that families and individuals can get the information they need. So we all probably remember how confusing it was with the different vaccine rollouts, and every state had their own prioritization categories, and who of people with disabilities fit into those and how was very confusing. So my team and I created like a dashboard that would help people understand that in your state, how did your state define developmental disability? How do they define chronic illness? In what category, like were you 3A? And in what category were they right now? So that you could hopefully get that information quickly. So some of my work has involved some of that, like tracking and interpretation. Other of the work has involved feedback to policymakers and leaders who are making those decisions about who to prioritize. And so some of the feedback we've given in that space around things like bringing vaccines to people's homes. To give a specific example is, originally the thought was, well, if we're going to bring vaccines to people's home, let's only bring the Johnson and Johnson because it's one shot and that's easier. And we only have to come once. But we also rose the concern of, in those early days of not knowing whether Johnson and Johnson had equal efficacy, we didn't want people who were homebound or wanted to be vaccinated in their homes for various reasons to have a less protective vaccine option. So sometimes it's been feedback like that I'm sure you all can relate to, where well-intended actions sometimes can have unintended consequences with our disability community. We see
Yeah.
that a lot. So I think what has helped me to understand this issue more is that I really had to learn that loneliness and social isolation are not the same thing. And so social isolation has to do with having very few, or in some cases, no personal relationships with others. And so I think I really have appreciated some of the work that has challenged providers or family members or individuals to think about who is surrounding a person that is not paid to be there. How many people does a person have in their life that are there because they want to be there? Call them, check on them, send them a card, whatever it may be. But so social isolation is really that lack of those connections. Whereas loneliness is a little bit more individualized, in that we've probably all heard the quote of um, or the experience of feeling lonely in a crowded room sometimes. So loneliness can happen regardless of how many social connections a person has. And so it's a bit individualized in terms of whether a person perceives themselves to be lonely or not. And so you can probably also think about how that there are lots of intersections here with mood. So we know that depression can kind of play tricks on our mind in the way that it can, convince us that we're lonely, not fun to be around, nobody wants us. I don't see patients clinically anymore, but when I did, I focused on kind of a CBT approach of countering that type of messaging that we know is coming more from the depression than the truth or the facts. But so you can probably see how loneliness can um, can intersect with some other facets of life too, that according to research, both loneliness and social isolation are more common among people with disabilities. And so I think this brings home, why this topic is important to those of us that work with and care about. And for me, I'm a member of that community, but it's also a topic that not many people know how to address. So there's kind of, which I think is good and bad, in that there's some good space for innovations. And I'm going to share with you some of the state models of what creative approaches some states have tried. And even when some of them sound a little off the wall, one involves, which state was it? I made a note, I think it was New York, that has sent out, since the pandemic started, 1,100 animatronic pets to people with disabilities, which I had never heard of, but it was backed by this pilot study data that showed that people were interacting with these animatronic pets day after day, and that they were reporting, positive mood increases. So, I mean, it was backed by this pilot study. They didn't just send out the 1,100 as like their first try, but I thought that was a fascinating, like, creative approach. And so sometimes I think when you have these areas of little to no focused in work, which is really where we are when you add loneliness, social isolation, and COVID, because in the past, a lot of the interventions that we would suggest are just not recommended with COVID. So we are in kind of this no man's land, but it also opens the door, I think, for creativity. So first kind of opening point I wanted to make was making sure there was clarity between what's social isolation, what's loneliness, and then how we measure that matters too. And there has been some interesting writing around the aspect of disability and solitude, which is different than loneliness and social isolation too. And I think I've seen this commented on in different ways. So I read a essay from a young adult with a disability who reflected on that solitude for them was a personal choice many times, and that it was part personality, part preference, part not having the social pressure of being judged for the way one looks, the way one eats, the way one, functions. So they really articulated well just this place of being at peace with solitude most of the time, and how for them sometimes that meant countering ideas of, like, they're a young person, they're 22, they should be out and about, and they should have, kind of the society's idea of what does a 22-year-old, a happy 22-year-old look like. So I read that essay, but I thought how important it was to also separate out solitude from what we're talking about. But also, I like that quote, I'm alone, but I ain't lonely. Yeah. There's such a difference. And I also heard from many parents of kids with disabilities during the pandemic who said things along the lines of, this was already our life. We already limited going out. And for some people that was for infectious control, but for many people, they were more talking about just the lack of access in the community, the social stigma that comes along with that when you go somewhere that sometimes for some people it's just not worth it, that you don't get the social connectedness gains that kind of balance out the frustrations and the losses. So I thought that was really interesting too, and that some people were reflecting that they were grateful that other people had the experience of, thinking twice about just hopping in the car and going somewhere. And so I thought that we can learn a lot from those different narratives around social isolation and loneliness. And I dug in a little bit in terms of how do we measure this if we know it's complicated. And so it really is important, if you're thinking about loneliness, you have to measure low perceived, oh, sorry, my Alexa's going off to remind, hold on. To remind us to get our little one off the bus for my husband. We've set numerous reminders. So we really do have to measure the perception of loneliness, which, as you can imagine, what a survey question would look like, it wouldn't be how many friends do you have? It would be more like, do you feel like that you have a good number of friends? Would you like to have more friends? But you can also think about how that kind of more abstract level of thinking around one's social network is also going to be more complicated to measure for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, especially if communication is a challenge for them. So I don't have any great answers of how the field of psychology has figured out how to measure this well, because they have not, we have not, I guess.
Kara,
But yeah.
real quick, just one thing we had found when we were talking to adults with intellectual disabilities long before COVID, but when we were looking at residential options and stuff, as they said, basically loneliness is the worst disability of all. That,
Mhm.
once they got out of public school and became an
Yeah.
adult, if you will, the limited access, like you said, to community and friends dropped. So they had no choice but to, quote, be in that social isolation. They didn't have that connectedness. But
Yeah.
then again, I like your separation of loneliness and social isolation, but that social isolation leads to that loneliness concept.
Yep.
And how do you bridge that barrier, particularly now with COVID, or even
Yeah.
before COVID, when you don't have that access?
Yeah, I totally agree. There's that cliff, and we talk about it in terms of employment often, but I think we also need to talk about it in terms of what does a meaningful day look like for someone.
Mhm.
And we've lost so many of those options with COVID, and unfortunately, it looks like many of them are not going to be coming back. We had a number of different options just here in Cincinnati where adults with intellectual disabilities could spend their time in different ways, ranging from segregated adult day programs, which are not my preference as a disability advocate, but for many people gave them some place to go during the day, and some people that they had relationships with. We also had programs though that were matched to people's interests and needs. We had a melodic connections, which allowed people to go play musical instruments, take music lessons. It was focused around kind of a music therapy bend. That program folded during COVID. From what I've heard, they're trying to kind of get picked up by another organization that they would be able to be under and wouldn't have to be independent. But we also lost a similar program that was focused on the visual arts, which allowed people with disabilities to go and have a place to paint and then to display their work, and then all the interaction that came along with that. And I mean, that's just off the top of my head in my little region of programs that are gone, from the last 2 years, and just so fewer options that people have for that social connectedness. I think that, as you mentioned, Colleen, just talking to people with IDD, which is probably going to mean more qualitative research, less survey-based research, is going to help us understand more of with more nuanced experiences of loneliness and social isolation, and also social connectedness. I think COVID, we've all heard these kind of feel good stories of COVID, people being excited to see their UPS man because now they, pay attention that, oh, it's the same guy. Whereas before, we didn't notice some of those details of life. And there have been many comments about these different kind of informal, casual, unexpected relationships that have sprung up, and those can be meaningful for people. So I hope I see that more as a qualitative opportunity. Would I consider, like when I go in our local drugstore, I tend to see the same woman at checkout, and she always has, something nice to say to me and my kids. And um, but if you ask me, do like how many friends, if I had to calculate friends, I probably wouldn't count her as a friend. But does she, bring me joy in that social connection when yeah. So I think I lean towards qualitative to really get a fuller picture of what relationships a person with a disability has, because they may not be as defined and easy to fit in boxes as when we measure non-disabled people. Many non-disabled people, go to the workplace to have their daily social connection. And I mean, we're even seeing adaptations with that as many of us are at home. Um, but it's interesting that a lot of our workplaces are thinking about how and when to bring us back for that social connectedness purpose. Not so much to chum it up around the water cooler, but just recognizing that we tend to work well if we have that opportunity.
Kara,
Any thought?
can I,
Yeah.
quick question. As you look at this and the impact on the individual with a disability. I can only think about Murthy's book about talking about loneliness as a public health issue for the general population.
Yep.
And I'm thinking about, we're asking many times staff to help people battle loneliness who they themselves are lonely and feel cut out.
Yep.
And just as you were talking about that, I thought, you know, where, and the families that feel
Hmm.
already this was their life before because they couldn't go to things that they wanted to because they didn't have the respite or somebody to do this, that it's really, what's the right word? It's endemic. It's not pandemic, but I mean
Yeah.
it
Mhm.
is.
Or syndemic even because it's
Yeah,
so systemic
yeah.
in, yeah.
Because I was thinking about the staff that, the staff in the south side of Chicago who told their provider that coming to work was the safest thing they did because where they live it was dangerous. They thought they could get shot. So
Oh,
Yeah.
no.
the the idea that it's something that you need to battle for everybody. It's not just.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I
No,
just
I
thought
think
that
that's
was really
important. It's the idea too of that we're not, this is a different um skill set that we're asking people to have than a lot of provider tasks would be. So if I'm good at, measuring medicine and making sure someone gets it at the same time every day and helping them, organize their life and or turn, all the things that we ask a DSP to do, I'm not sure where this fits exactly in the skill set. Um, and I've never heard of anybody getting very much training around this. Um, some people are naturally good at, I think, socially connecting to others, but I don't entirely think that should be a requirement. And I mean, I think we all know that with the shortage, it's not as if, we're screening people for their social connectedness ability.
great.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that lends itself a whole nother challenge of, I don't really think you can compartmentalize this. Like, I don't know that you could be an excellent facilitator of social connectedness while also feeling lonely and disconnected yourself. That would seem to be hard. You bring up a great point about the health risks. Some of the data that's tried to extrapolate, and now this data is more on like a general population, and much of it's focused on loneliness and aging. But so they looked at mortality rates um, and found strong correlations between people who were lonelier for longer periods of time dying earlier, and they correlated it to the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Wow.
That's the impact of loneliness on health. So I thought that really stood out to me also as I think sometimes we see this work as like extra and nice to do, but it really literally is shortening people's lives. And I don't think it's that people don't want to help with this. I think that it's hard to know how.
Mhm.
Um, Many, of us are grappling in our own ways with this, or people we love are grappling with it. And, if we knew how to help, we'd help them more.
Mhm.
Um, so I
Do
think
you
that
have
is
any,
tough.
this is Colleen, do you have any like, um, if, we're all on Zoom now, of course,
Yeah.
and stuff, then we continue to be on that. And, with our, do you, any information, like, does that seem to help? Are those ways to keep people connected, or do they need that actual physical presence, or is there any research on that that it changes the shift on that health perspective? Because I mean, Zoom is okay, but then, sometimes I think it's, when we lose our distraction, we hear somebody talking in the other room, something goes on. You're not, I'm finding as we go on and we do more, we continue to do more Zoom or more go to meetings or things like that, that people are kind of getting more distant again, or like I said, I don't know if it's socialized, it's not loneliness, but it's that gap between, being connected and being social.
Yeah. That disconnectedness. Um, you can feel, I think, differently in different circles. And um, what's the first part of your question?
I was
I
just
can,
wondering if there was any research or any,
oh,
comments
yeah.
about, in-person physical presence versus the technological presence. you talked about a little bit about people going back into the office,
Yeah.
to have kind of that relationship. And I know, I'd say there's a lot of different companies, large companies, small companies saying, we want you back in the office half-time, but you can
Mhm.
stay home half-time or whatever. Just,
Yeah.
I mean, just thinking of that, so.
And that's going to be interesting for so many reasons. I mean, you're going to have coworkers who, didn't jive well are now going to be able to not have to see each other to work that out every day. They may be able to develop schedules that, so you may have like different, almost like alliances of workforces. And yeah, so it's going to introduce all kinds of interesting, I think, dynamics. But I think we're just now to a point where we're able to see more. One of the call outs for more research needed is comparative effectiveness research around in-person supports, interventions for this, and remote that would answer exactly that question, Colleen. I don't think that we have good answers right now because it doesn't seem fair to compare, pre-COVID in-person interventions to post during COVID remote, because they're not, it's kind of apples and oranges. We almost need that. Now we're in this place, if we offer the same intervention to people, but we offer it two different modalities, which would, have better results for, and are there differences across different preferences in learning and needs and disability types and all of that too.
So the interesting thing you just touched on there, Colleen, too, when you talked about this in person and vice versa, that you know providers have told me that their managers actually have learned in COVID they can check in with a staff member via Zoom at a group home or a waiver home at night, and they don't have to drive 30 minutes to get there and then 30 minutes to the next house. So they're more efficient seeing people, and they're reporting that that's more effective. You wonder about that. But
Mhm.
the other thing, when Carol, when you were just talking, it just struck me again. 80% of the workforce in the IDD world is in the residential side, and they're working with people in their homes,
Mhm.
their homes or a group home or some shared living arrangement like that. And their 8 hour workday is generally spent with maybe one other colleague,
Mhm.
and then two, three, four, eight, or if you're in Illinois, 15
Mhm.
people with disabilities living together. And boy, I don't know if anybody's really looked at this at what was the level of loneliness when we start pre-COVID,
Mhm.
and now, and how this ties into people burning out and
Mhm.
leaving the field, and the high turnover rates and all of the stresses in the system that I don't, you're right. I don't think I've heard any training that providers have gotten or folks doing about helping your staff deal with the loneliness of,
Mhm.
they can't come to a meeting during the day of all the staff because they're sleeping because they worked last night, you know.
Right. Yeah. Mhm.
So it's just, boy, it's really making me think about this in some whole new ways as you've laid this out.
Yeah. One of the quotes from the research that really struck me too with this is that loneliness spreads through a contagious process. And what I thought was interesting was this study was pre-COVID. This was like 2013, I think. And I thought, oh my gosh, so now we have, loneliness and COVID both spreading through this contagious process. But what they were commenting on was this collapse of communities and supports. So it really talked about loneliness spreading from individuals to families. So you have individuals within families who are lonely. You have family units who are lonely, more than one individual, even if they're living together, lonely. And then communities who have this collapse of connections and, you know, don't know their neighbor, don't really know anybody, in their community, drive to work, come back, um, so this author, and I can send that citation after our meeting too, was commenting on how to really get to this problem, it has to be um, multi-layered. So yes, we need individual interventions, but we also need family level interventions and even community level interventions. That if we want to make the biggest impact, and we should be motivated to when we have this huge, red siren of a health risk equivalent to 15 cigarettes a day and these, shortened lifespans, um, that community initiatives would be important. And so I can list off some of what those look like. So I'm going a little bit out of order of what I jotted down, but if you're curious about like what would a community level intervention look like, so setting up volunteering connections, group gratitude practices. Of course, when we are able to connect health promotion to this, we amplify our gains. So if we were able to get a walking club for a group, we're not only getting the benefits of the social connectedness potentially, but also the physical exercise gains. So that's really kind of doubling your investment for these interventions. There was mention about the value of intergenerational connections, that we've seen so many interesting pilot programs. And I know I've caught some of these on nightly news where, they put preschools in a senior home, or they pair a college student with a widow that needs house repairs or something. But it has yet to be kind of done on a larger scale. The and largely our U.S. Centric culture is, I feel like over relies on this idea of independence, and intergenerational families living together is often seen as a bad thing, whereas this is the norm in many places around the world, and there are certain benefits to that. And I think we saw that during COVID. I mean, we heard of people moving in with family, and some of those people have stayed and maybe will stay together, which, we don't want overcrowding, but we, in terms of the demographics of who is most at risk within the disability community for loneliness, it's highest among people with disability who are younger, which I found interesting, economically disadvantaged, living alone, and low levels of access to environmental assets.
Say that
So,
again about the living
yeah,
alone, because in my world, in Indiana, they push and push and push about everybody with a disability should be living out on their own in the community.
mhm,
And we found that the people that we support that live out in the community, they're the only one with a disability in their apartment complex. They don't have connectedness with anyone else in their apartment. They,
right,
other than staff coming, they were very isolated in this, COVID pandemic, even more so than, before, because, because of the physical restrictions in terms of, you can't go out, small groups, mask wearing,
yeah,
things like that, that living alone is not always ideal for, individuals, because it can sometimes, if I'm understanding you correctly, sometimes living alone can feed into that social isolation. And then that mental perspective of loneliness, you know.
right. Yeah, I think there's that, again, that kind of toxic independence value, that toxic value on independence that we place, when really you look at the peers, and not that it's a bad thing to live alone, but when I think of um, my adult peers also with disabilities, um, or with and without disabilities, most do not live alone. Most live in some type of family unit. So it's interesting that when someone has a disability, we prioritize that as the goal. I mean, I do appreciate the goal of avoiding a congregate setting, because we know that's so dangerous, but we've limited things like like combining waivers. I know, at least in Ohio, if I have a waiver and I want my friend who has a waiver and we want to be roommates, there's no way to combine those waivers for us to get, an apartment that would still be less than, two of us independently,
Mhm.
but and this would be like my choice in roommate. We don't have good systems for that in Ohio. I don't, do you all have better options for that?
No, no, we don't. It's very difficult pairing individuals or matching unless, like you say, they're
Yeah.
typically, unless they're family members. There's just a lot of issues with two people who don't know each other
Yeah.
trying to, coexist in a small space.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
most kids growing up, like say in a family unit, whether a disability or not, have their own room, they have their own
Hmm.
TV, they have their own phone, they're not used to sharing, if you will.
Yep.
but so it's becomes that, effort of how do you, somebody who already has anxiety issues or something like that, it kind of gets, feeds into some of those more mental health issues, I think, sometimes.
Well, I
Yeah.
think that, when we start talking about the clear distinction you made between social isolation and loneliness and the person that likes solitude, there's this great YouTube video. I think it's been seen 20,000 times. A guy named Carl. And Carl had this giant budget in Tennessee, $180,000 a year. Older guy, failed in a group home, failed in a waiver home, just was not happy. Finally talked to him, and his goal in life, he wanted to live in a trailer house because he had told that his grandma lived in a trailer house.
Hmm.
And everybody said, well, you don't want to live in a trailer house. Wrong kind of people live in trailer parks. And he said, my grandma lived in a trailer park.
Yeah.
And so they got him a trailer house and they used remote technology. So he lives alone. This guy got a $180,000 budget or something like that, huge budget.
Hmm.
And his number one behavior problem is he was addicted to Coca Cola. So, left to his own devices, he would drink a case of Coca Cola a day. So,
Wow.
this really smart technology guy came up with this thing that it dispensed one can of Coke, and he likes the real Coke. I mean,
Yeah.
the full 200 calories,
Yeah.
milk.
Go big, go home. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, he it dispensed in his refrigerator one can every 6 hours. So it had a
Reasonable.
little timer in it, and he loaded it up, and he can't jiggle with it, and he knew to budget his Coke that way.
Yeah.
And he was this remarkably successful guy. They used Ring technology on his doorways, in-home monitors. His budget went from $180,000 to less than $50,000 a year. And he was totally happy. And then they got nervous because this same guy showed up every Sunday and he kind of looked like the Blues Brothers, dark glasses, black suit, black hat. And he'd come get Carl and they'd take off. And turns out this guy's taking Carl to church.
Mm.
And he lives in the trailer house a couple ones down, and they met
Yeah.
somewhere in the laundromat or wherever. And he said, why don't you come to church with me on Sundays? And that, other than that, he likes sitting and listening to his headphones with his country music and being alone. And
Yeah.
he's quite happy with that. And
That's
that's
solitude. That's the,
he,
Yeah.
he's chosen solitude where somebody else it would drive him nuts.
Hmm.
He is just happy as all can get out. And
Yep.
he chose to go to church. Now, he still goes to a day program during the day,
Hmm.
and he's 68 years old, so not really looking to get him a job, but
Hmm.
he volunteers in some places. But that really struck me that we look, I think, too much on the setting, size, or location
Hmm.
as opposed to what goes on inside the place.
Yep.
And when you talked about that that difference between loneliness and isolation, and you can be lonely in a crowd
Hmm.
if you don't fit and you don't belong and you
Yeah.
don't. Yeah, I just think that.
It really is. I mean, HCBS, home and community-based services, should be everything that supports somebody to live in the community the way they want. And there is variety in that. For him, that meant a trailer home. And
Yeah,
yeah, and we have this stigma that, him living in an apartment by himself would be better than a trailer home, when
yeah,
is interesting because fiscally, a an apartment is going to be much more expensive. And then, I mean, I've lived in an apartment and you hear noises and I mean, it's hard to not live in an apartment where you aren't having, I would think, more kind of disturbance by your neighbors than what I would think most trailers. I would think you'd feel a little more, be a little more quiet. You'd be more on your own. I mean, yeah, just a great example of truly individualized planning for somebody and person-centered, what worked for him, and even with the Coke addiction, which I can relate to
yeah.
with Pepsi. I should get that. I should get that technology. Um, For sure.
Well, apparently this is something pretty common because he just bought it off the shelf. It wasn't like they made it, you know. It
Oh
just
gosh.
it is. So you're not alone, and neither was Carl. But
Yeah.
uh, and I think that gets to your point, Colleen, that there are folks that just jump off the cliff on size or location
Mhm.
without realizing that that in many ways is secondary to what the social environment is for
Yeah,
people
Hmm.
that they choose.
Yep.
yeah, I agree.
In all of our work around destigmatizing disability and making environments more accessible can help move the needle towards this too. You know, we have better curb cuts. I hear from so many people who, and I've experienced this in different places I've lived, where there's like one curb cut that if that one curb cut was better, they could get, you know, XYZ. And so those opportunities, because that last point in the higher risk for loneliness of low levels of access to environmental assets. I mean, I think that's a very academic way of saying not being able to get in your community. You know, an environmental asset could be the opportunity to be able to get to Kroger on your own or to get to the drugstore on your own to pick up things if you needed rather than having to worry about somebody else. And so anything that we're doing to make communities more accessible and accepting is also, I think, moving the needle on this loneliness effort that I hope, you know, I know we're collaborating on, but I wish more would. I also wanted to tell you about some state-led supports that have come out since COVID. So these are interesting because they have considered this as an urgent problem, and then also, you know, their interventions match with all the considerations that we still have to make in terms of social distancing and um, you know, and various levels of vaccination. So California has developed a interweb of neighbor to neighbor supports, which allows people to be matched up and then gives ideas for connections, and then also incentivizes in the same way in the health promotion world that we found that people like little intangible incentives for things like your step count, or, you know, some people like closing their ring on their Apple Watch, trying to incentivize more frequent connections to neighbors. And they've also given people, you know, ideas about how to keep that safe related to COVID. So of course, California weather allows for more check-ins outside, but Minnesota does not, and they also have a pretty advanced, so they're using a wiki page where they update it daily, and it's targeted towards seniors with disabilities, but I think the main resource is that recognizing that with COVID, there's been so many changes that people don't know what to expect. I mean, we've seen hours change and, you know, business hours change in ways that haven't happened before in my memory, at least. So this allows people to kind of see what's available now, what may be new, what may be changed, what may be back, because as I mentioned, you know, there are programs that closed, but now are reopening in different ways. Nevada has they call it their social support action team, and it is pretty multifaceted, but it includes one-to-one check-in calls. And it looks like those are done by staff that are part of this action team. And then they've also put together these small groups that are peer support, and that is through Zoom. So that potentially could be an area of, you know, comparing those interventions. And then I have just two more. New York, they identified like a 5-tier service system that connected home delivered meals, groceries and hygiene supplies, medication delivery. They connected that to transportation to critical services, which I thought was interesting because their definition of critical service is broader than what I've often seen with like Medicaid transportation to healthcare appointments is pretty limited. Um, this critical services could potentially be used for more social connectedness too, in terms of, you know, a weekly support group or an opportunity to exercise, you know, in a park. Or, and then the fifth one was this uh, combating social isolation is what is the fifth priority, but that one was the one that the animatronic animals were under. So I would really like to see a picture of this animatronic animal, but I
We
didn't see
we
that
have
in the
two. We
report.
have a cat and a dog.
Do you
And
really?
Really?
yeah, you can get them off Amazon for like $100, and
Wow, what do they do?
they're feel like a real animal, and they
Mhm.
move. They have the mechanics that so they're kind of, and the cat purrs and the dog
Mm.
wags his tail and wags his tail the more you pet him and stuff. And
Oh,
it's definitely for individuals with kind of some social anxiety, particularly in a group setting. They'll kind of pass it around. Somebody will hold on to it. You know,
nice.
they're really cute. So
I gotta check them out.
I have to send you, yeah, just search
Yeah, I'll
on
make sure I
Amazon.
found one.
Yeah.
I mean, my 4-year-old has like a cheaper one that, like barks, and I was thinking it wasn't that, like she'll
Yeah,
just like bark a little bit, but it's not like an ongoing kind of pet feel.
yeah.
And it's not very responsive. And the
It-
last state that had a plan that I'll mention is Michigan. And their plan was interesting to me because I don't know that we know the relationship between loneliness and susceptibility to scams, but I think just anecdotally, I feel like I've observed it. Even I can think of my grandmother when she was in her late 90s. She was the victim of a Nigerian like phone call scam. And, I think a lot of it was because she was willing and needed and wanted to talk to people on the phone. And so unfortunately, talk to that scammer. So I think it is creative that Michigan um, recognized potentially that connection between loneliness and susceptibility to scams. So they have some of their social media campaigns targeting people with disabilities involves avoidance of COVID related scams, resilience measures, and tips, and then encouragement of people with disabilities who they can or should reach out to. So a little bit different approach in that I noticed most of the other states kind of go with like external to internal, and this one instead is messaging to the disability community saying, hey, if you're lonely, reach out. So I don't know which is better, or if maybe it would be better if we combined both.
Mhm.
um, but that is the angle Michigan's going. So
Kara, there's another really important thing that you just touched on there. I don't know if anybody's read the guy's book. He was a young man, high functioning autism. Again, words we should use. It's how he
yeah,
describes himself.
yeah.
Um, in Chicago, lonely, skipping school all the time, didn't fit in. Anyway, he was hanging out in an alleyway one day, and these three guys in a little Mustang convertible came by and said, "Hey, what are you doing? Why don't you come with us?" Well, they turned out to be a neo-Nazi group, and
Gosh.
he was embedded with them for over 18 years,
Oh my gosh.
and brainwashed, and finally figured out what was going on, and he broke away. But they were actively targeting males with mild disabilities who had no friends.
Mm,
And they adopted this kind of radical, here's who my enemies are. This is why you were lonely. Now you're not lonely. You're part of us.
yeah.
And he finally broke away, and now he's giving speeches about it, of saying, if you have a
Wow,
child
what's
with
his name?
autism, I'll have to look it up and get it.
Yeah, I would
Uh,
love to look into that.
but he finally broke away, and then they came after him, and then he started talking about this and
Yeah.
their recruiting techniques. And the other thing that Murthy talks about is he believes, no research around it, he believes that the political divisiveness we have is based in loneliness.
Mm,
That people that buy these conspiracy theories somehow all of a sudden belong to something now, and they're
yeah.
not alone. They're in this chat group, or they're in this deal. And my brother-in-law just fits that parameters. He has no friends.
Yeah.
He's no relationships in his life, but at the internet, and he's in all these hate groups that,
Yep.
it is. Well, I should pass along a secret investment strategy he's got. You should buy the Iraqi dinar, their currency,
Okay.
Oh,
because any day now it's going to be worth 2,000 times what it is today.
oh,
So
good.
he's been buying Iraqi money for 2 decades now.
Really
Oh
good.
my goodness.
Yeah, it's nutty. But
Well,
anyway,
it's fascinating because I met with this man named Stu Schulman, and he has this fascinating career where he worked with like the Department of Defense for a while and did all these kind of like exciting undercover things that he was vague about but sounded exciting. But now he developed this software that kind of scans Twitter differently, and you can pull up sentiment of tweets. So kind of like, what's the mood behind a tweet? Is it angry? Is it influential, persuasive, all of that. So he applied that software to really delve into QAnon. And so months and months ago, I had this interest in understanding what QAnon's views on disability were. So I met with him. We had a one-on-one meeting, and we talked about similar to what you're mentioning, John, and that no, he's embedded in all these like forums kind of for research purposes. And he said, no, QAnon is not, of course, there is some eugenic stuff because there's that like underpinning of white supremacy and neo-Nazism, but which, neither are fans of disabled life really, but he said beyond that, there's not a lot of explicit discussion about disability, but he mentioned the exact same thing in terms of, he said that if you look at literacy rates among the people communicating and just styles of communication, that one could read in that you've got many people who may be susceptible due to limited intellectual functioning or a wide range of other things that cause them to feel socially excluded. And now they've turned to this group that has, a motto and heroes, and it's got a lot of structure too, interestingly, like you're told exactly who to follow, what to believe, and so in a lot of ways, I think there's dangers to falling into that. Thanks, Christian Piccolini.
Yeah, I found this guy's story. He was recruited at 14
Oh, wow.
and didn't break away till like he was in his 30s and realized what.
Mm-hmm.
But they filled this need. So
Yeah.
I recently read that Target has opened up during the weekdays only like self-checkout lanes, but because they know people want that social interaction, and they know in vulnerable populations such as senior citizens and people in the disability community, they have minimum two cashiers open, and it's mostly those folks. And you'll see like some of the workers walking around, and then if you're young and able bodied, they ask the person like, hey, if you want faster checkout. And sometimes the person will say, I want to talk. I experienced that at my local Target here on the west side. And I think that's really nice. But it was also like on Monday at 9:30.
Yeah, that's awesome.
what is your research and reading and tell you too about the person with IDD who was also a chair user, and what is that? Does it increase the likelihood of isolation? Is it the people that work with them? Is that a challenge as well, that they see them as less capable or less needing this?
I would think, and what I've observed is just that, that multiple marginalization. So you've not only got the barriers related to intellectual disability, but now you've also got the structural barriers, and a lot of the social programs that are designed, for people with intellectual disabilities, and we can have lots of discussions about, segregation and inclusion. My perspective on that is that our world has a need and a space for both. There are times that I culturally want to be with other people with disabilities, and that's not a failure of me to be included. There are also times that I want to be able to go to my community center and should be able to access that. So I think sometimes we mistakenly measure the success of inclusion by like, to say person with a disability is dropped into, all 20 non-disabled people, and that's inclusion. When again, if they feel lonely in that environment and they don't feel like it's an authentic relationship, that's not inclusion to me. Our family just joined an interesting, I don't even know what you'd call it, and I'm familiar with these things, but so it's called Pause for Families, and it was intended to be a respite organization. It's funded through our county board of BD, And to join, you have to have a family member with a developmental disability, and you go through like a interview process so that they understand your needs and wants. You do a journey map, I think they call it, which is kind of like, what do you want for your life and your family's life or whatever. So we went to our first outing as a family, and the director was really honest with me. She said, you know, this event that we host works out for your family, but many of the ones that we've done in the past would not, because we don't think of physical accessibility needs. So, and I think I see that in a lot of events that plan themselves well for people with intellectual disabilities, they're not necessarily physically accessible. So, and then, you know, vice versa, I've seen a lot of unfair exclusion also from programs that are targeted towards people with physical disabilities being ableist towards people with intellectual disabilities. And yeah, so we don't play very well together when we should. We're on the same team.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting phenomena.
Yeah, there's a hierarchy, and I think it gets played out in a few different ways in terms of competing for resources too. And
Yeah.
you know, we're not necessarily taking from the pie if one group gets what they need, and but you know, that's a larger systems problem.
This is where our waivers don't work together. So we have a what we call terrible name, age and disabled waiver.
Mm,
It's for people with physical disabilities and seniors.
aging. I don't know.
Yeah, aging. And then we have what's called the family support waiver, which is our capped waiver for people with IDD. And then we've got the community integration waiver, which is the big waiver, big dollars. We won't let a person on the age and disabled waiver live with a person and let the two waivers fund them both together. And
Hmm.
well, we will, but it's incredibly hard, right? I
Complicated,
mean,
yeah.
I mean, it is really hard. So that I've got a little bit of money, but I'm able-bodied and I can do some things, but I need some direction. And here's
Yeah.
this senior whose mind works great, but their body doesn't work too well, that needs a lot of
Hmm.
help with things. They could be a really good match.
Yeah.
But we make it really hard. You know, we have to
Hmm.
jump through so many hoops that it's it becomes really difficult.
Yeah, we saw that play out here. We have LAD. Oh gosh, I always forget. So it's LADD, Living Arrangements for the Developmentally Disabled. They've been around for
Yeah.
a long time. They've expressed that same frustration, and that they have a smart homes pilot model that allows people with intellectual disabilities to choose their roommates. That, you know, so this group of 4 women and this group of 4 men both were going to live in the 2 pilots of the smart homes. And even with all the waiver experts in the world, they could not figure out allowances to combine and share these waivers. So for the first 2 pilot programs, it ended up having to be people that could pay, self-pay I think it comes to like 1,100 a month or something, and that includes, you know, their rent and their providers and everything, which is less than a lot of families are paying, but also not affordable for many
Right.
people. I mean, that's way over SSI.
Right.
So, yeah. And we could talk about the implicate, yeah, not equitable. And Rebecca, I wanted to go back to your comment too about um, marriage limitations. I mean, things like the, you know, discouragement of people who receive SSI to get married because they could lose their life sustaining, you know, benefits. I do hear that as a not insignificant number of people that keeps them separated from their partner that they, you know, love. Like, and that in itself, I think, is a significant contributor to loneliness. Again, so it's not necessarily that lack of social connectedness. They have somebody they love and want to marry, and with our government structure, they're not able to. Interest.
Yeah, it's a real financial
Right.
loss.
Yeah.
A young couple that now they're not so young anymore. They're both in their late 40s in Columbus, and they've been engaged for 12 years,
Mhm.
and they can't afford to get married. So, and they both have real strong religious views, so they don't want to live together without being
Yeah.
married. And so
Yeah.
it's this catch 22.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought about that when you were telling your recruitment story, not at all to compare religion and that recruitment. But it is interesting to think about. I do think that people with disabilities in seeking social connectedness can be more interested in those types of connections, whether it be, religious structures often do have weekly programs, looking at it aside from the spiritual or faith-based angle, just the potential for the community involvement, but also, again, always needing to not be paternalistic, but aware of anybody getting involved in people that have other motives. I know my first introduction to somebody with active psychosis was in college. My next door roommate had bipolar disorder, and she got very involved, and she had cerebral palsy, and she got very involved with kind of a radical church group that came on campus and recruited her heavily. And so they convinced her to stop taking her medicine and just kind of put it in God's hands.
Wow.
And I don't know whose hands it was in, but it was not good. It was
Yeah.
a nudity incident, and it was very bad. But it definitely was striking to me how that recruitment, we all want to be wanted and we want belonging, and sometimes the wrong places can offer that.
When I was with the ARC, we have a trust, and we had this young man who was incredibly lonely. He called the trust office 17 times a day. Not because he didn't need anything. Everybody was there to talk to him, and people would get annoyed. And I said, think about it. He has no one else that'll talk to him. So
Yeah.
we're just talk to him. Realize that. But then these guys selling door to door discovered him, and he had an apartment, and he lived very independently. But he'd welcome them in. And before long, he had signed contract. At one point, he had 6 different cell phone contracts.
Oh, wow.
Because he liked talking to these people. And he had not been adjudicated incompetent. So we ended up buying off the cell phone contract because it was, yes, they took advantage of him, but he just liked talking to him. And I thought it reminded me of my 91-year-old father-in-law that he's widower and bought like this $3,000 vacuum cleaner because this guy spent 2 hours selling him this really nice vacuum cleaner, and he said he was the nicest young man. And
Oh my gosh.
and Elmer
It's like
could
a car.
afford it. Yeah, he could afford it. Yeah, but it's like once he did it, he said, this will pick up kerosene off my floor. I said, let's not try that out.
Yeah.
How often do you have
This-
kerosene on your floor?
Well, this guy came in and rattled off all the things. It was an Electrolux vacuum cleaner that supposedly would last 3 lifetimes. And I said, Elmer, you're 91 years old.
Right.
What are you going to do with it? It only has,
Probably
Yeah.
too heavy for him to move around.
Yeah.
But
Oh my
your
gosh.
point about how susceptible people can be to this idea of friends that aren't really your friends.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Kara, we so appreciate your time and information.
Yeah, this has been fun. Thank you all so much.
Fascinating. Yes.
It really is. And I'll follow up with an email with a couple of the resources I mentioned, and that way we can also all be connected and socially connected, right?
Okay.
Great.
Now you know what
Great.
isolation means on your calendar.
Yeah.
I feel a lot better because I was like,
How many-
"Am I supposed to be
How many
isolated?"
kids? How many kids do you have?
I have 3, so 4, 11, and 14.
Oh my
wow.
gosh.
Probably not a lot of isolation at home. For
No,
you.
I was thinking about the beauty of solitude. I don't know. That would be nice.